Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to another security talk. It's going to be fun, trust me, because I need your help on things first. Let's start, before we actually get started with live hacking and problems and breaches and all that sort of stuff, let's go for this word, DevSecOps. Who have heard of this word before? Who likes this word? Exactly 0 people that like the word DevSecOps. And I am with you. Don't get me wrong. Like, the first time I saw this word, it felt to me like yet another buzzword. Let's put it next to AI and blockchain, and we have buzzword bingo altogether. But if you look at DevOps, the 2 white parts, who of you practices DevOps or tries to practice DevOps or has heard of DevOps? At least people have heard of it, it's fine. DevOps was more or less tearing down the wall between developers and operations, and instead of, hey, it works on my machine, let's throw it over the wall, now it's together in one team. We have developers and we have operations, or in this case, DevOps people that bring it to production. Nowadays, it's more or less like, if I create it, to a certain extent, I'm also responsible of bringing it into production, and if something goes wrong, they probably call me at 3 in the morning to fix it again, right? Like that resonates, right? If that resonates with you, to some extent, you're doing DevOps. Because we tear down the wall between developers and operations. However, security is not yet a first-class citizen in the whole mindset of a development team. I mean, think about it. Look at your company. In most cases, the security team is still a siloed thing, and we work on features based on your Jira board or something. You look at that feature, it's probably like, as a product manager, I want, if I click on this, it does that. Very feature-driven. And security is an afterthought, like, hey, it works, fine, all tests are green, and then 2 months later, you got breached. Hopefully not, but that might happen. Security is an afterthought, and we need to change that. So that's what we're going to do today. This is me. My name is Brian. I'm a staff developer advocate. That means I code a little and email a lot. Nothing more. Yeah, I am a Java user group leader for the virtual Java user group and the Netherlands Java user group, etc., etc. Boring. Let's go to the interesting stuff. Let me tell you my story from, say, 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago already, but I don't want to get old, so I keep it at 15. Say, 15-ish years ago, I worked for the local government, or for the government in the Netherlands. I worked at one of the active agencies of the Ministry of Interior. Our software that we created was deployed 3 times a year. That was great, because works on my machine, throw it over the wall, ops, now you are working on this thing, and my pen testers had enough time to actually go into that. Fast forwarding to, say, 4 years ago, before I joined Sneak, I worked at a Dutch company called bol.com, which is the equivalent of Amazon, the web vendor. The team I was responsible for and I worked with deployed their software, their services, 3 to 4 times a day. Good luck with pen testing. Pen testing takes time. So the thing is, we're trying to deploy and deliver features better, faster, and stronger, and make sure that it's there before our competitors are having that same feature. And it makes sense, because, hey, in the end, we all need to make money. Unless you work for the government. You spend money. Trust me, been there. Anyway, the thing is that, actually, if you look at developments, and I already taught you, like, look at your Jira board. Look at your text. Who's using Jira, by the way? Who likes Jira? I will call my friends at Atlassian and say, like, nobody likes your crap. But we're all using it. But everything is feature-driven. We're not saying, like, it needs to be secure. Security is implicit, just like it was with scalability and maintainability. But now we're thinking of that as in maintainability, we just ask ChatGPT to rewrite our code, done. And scalability, we need to do that because we're in the cloud now. 10 years ago or 15 years ago, the cloud was not a thing. But we need to think of security as in the same way as we think about scalability and maintainability. Because now it is a siloed expertise at the end, and that means there's one security team helping dozens of engineering teams. And if a company grows, the amount of engineering teams grows, and most people, at least I didn't have it in school, and most people that come from engineering school or university do not have specifically drilled down into what are secure practices. No, I just know how to create a freaking Spring Boot application. Done, I get a job. The thing is, we need to work better together because in the end, we do not want to have our customer data out in the open, unless you want to be the headline of the next newspaper. So, it's all fun and games, Brian, but how bad is that situation? Well, let's talk about security and your application. The first thing you probably think of is your own code. The code that you write, or you let Copilot write, we just discussed that, but the code that, say, you write it. Let's keep it to that, old-fashioned, wrote it by hand, because I am the 10x developer. We probably look at that, but that is only tip of the iceberg. Pretty much 10 to 20% of the code that you put into production, of the binary, of that jar that you put into production, only 10 to 20% is the code that you wrote and is in your Git repository. Think about it. However, that code is super important because that is the difference between Spring as a general framework and it does actually things. So the business logic, the value is in that 10 to 20%. So who of you does code reviews? The rest of you does pair programming, I think. Great. So then let's do some pair programming reviewing exercise. I created my first very silly Spring Boot endpoint. What did I do wrong? Tick-tock. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2. The problem is here. I have a request parameter that is a username. And without doing any validation or sanitization, I write it to a response writer. Because I'm not using Timeleaf or any framework to do my rendering on the front end. No, I write it directly to the response writer. This means that if I don't check it, people can do crazy things like this. We call this reflective cross-site scripting. I can put in a very small JavaScript line, and it will get executed because it's there in the response writer, and it will get served to you as a user. Of course, an alert is silly, but if I can get an alert, that means I can execute JavaScript. And I can use that, for instance, to inspect your cookies, to see if your JSession ID maybe is available because you did not put it on HTTP only, for instance, and serve it to another website. You know what happens if I have your JSession ID? I can take over your session. If you're admin and I have your JSession ID, I can take over your admin session, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. So that's not a good thing, but hey, we all do code reviews. We have caught this, right? We are good. We have tools. We have AI. We've caught this. But let's get into another example. Like, this is one way of do cross-site scripting. There are multiple ways, like do mouse overs, image headers, like whatever. But let's go to an application. And I have an application here. Now let me enlarge it. This is my coffee shop application. Yes, for everybody who makes that silly joke, I am Dutch, and it's not a Dutch coffee shop. Don't try to order coffee at a Dutch coffee shop. This is the only thing I want to say to you. You won't get coffee. They have good brownies though, trust me. I scanned my code, and one of the things it said here, and obviously I'm using the Sneak tooling, but you can use other tooling anyway, but it's not about the tooling, it's about how you should work. So, not going into my dependencies, let's go into my code. I use my code checker here, and I saw, for instance, that there is a path traversal. So let's inspect that. What is that path traversal? It says, it starts at line 29, goes all the way to line 32. Sure, let's click on it. Let's see what it does. So this is my path traversal example. Basically, this is a routine or a method that is used to upload an image from a website using Spring Boot in this case. If you look at the general things, how to do this on the internet, like get a 101 tutorial on how to upload an image, you probably get something like this. The thing is, I'm getting the image in here as a multipart file, which is a request parameter from a post request. What I'm doing here, it says, hey, you're using the original file name. The only thing I'm doing here is replacing all spaces with underscores. Sure, because some OSs are a bit silly. Then I'm using the upload directory, which I already have and defined, and concatenate the original file name with the upload folder, and then I just store the image. Well, the thing is, what if my original file name is not a file name, but something like this? // // You know what a // does, right? It traverses back outside of the path, outside of the general path, and if I do // a gazillion times, I will end up in the root, go to something like this, and overwrite your pass WD, for instance. I am not inspecting my multipart file, I'm just using it. And then people say, yeah, sure, that's only hypothetical. Is this actually possible? Guess what? So let's run this application. Hopefully it runs. Let's pray to the demo gods and sacrifice. Application failed to start. You see, demo gods. Probably it's already running somewhere. Let me check. Live debugging on stage, never did that before. Oh, there's a lot of Java on it. Let's skip this one for a second. Trust me that it is possible to inspect the HTTP call, and the file name is metadata. By copying the HTTP request, the raw request, I can just alter the file name to .. / even if it's not the real file name. But it's metadata. I can alter an HTTP request, a raw HTTP request, with a tool like Burp Suite, and I can send that to your application. So although you might think this is not possible, it is actually quite simple. And it would have been easy if I have caught this already on the spot while I am programming, and not waiting until my CI pipeline comes up and screams at me, you cannot deploy. But while I'm programming, I need to fix this. This would be very interesting. So, okay, we talked about code, and you probably would not have found this issue when you did code reviews manually. However, if we look at some of the things that you can do, it says here, maybe you want to normalize your entry path and make sure that it starts with the actual destination path. And if not, you might want to throw an exception, because then you're trying to break out of that path and trying to create a file somewhere outside of the boundaries of your system. And then smart people would say, but that depends on the user, right? The privilege of the user. Totally correct. Trick question. If you put something in a Docker container, what is the default user? Root. Gotcha. Check your Docker containers. See if it runs as root, or if you have a specific user or not. So combining these things can be fun for me, not so much for you. But let's continue. I'm sorry that this demo didn't work. We'll do it later, hopefully. But let's continue first for the sake of time. So we talked about our own code, but that's only 10 to 20%. Let's go to whatever we're using. Who uses frameworks and libraries to create their Java application? Everybody who doesn't put their hands up is a liar, because we're all using at least one library. Probably you're using Maven or Gradle or maybe even SBT or something. Are there end users here? Thank God. I would send you away right away, but never mind. The thing is, we borrow a ton of crap from the internet. Hopefully you're up to date. But there's a good reason for that, because you do not want to create yet another corrupt repository, yet another endpoint by hand. You want to do that fast, and libraries can help you with that. Sure, no problem. Let me take you back to a problem with an open source library because people were simply using it and building their application on top of it. 2017. Yes, that was pre-COVID. COVID was not yet a thing, and dinosaurs were still alive. That's that long ago. 2017, who've heard of the company called Equifax? Who've heard of Equifax? Keep your hand up. Have you heard of Equifax before this breach? No, it's great marketing. At least 3 people know now, right? And we're not in the United States. It's great. But Equifax is a crediting company based in Atlanta, Georgia. Not important, but it's very important for the Americans because crediting scores are important to get a mortgage or to get a loan on your car or whatever. The thing was, they built their application based on Apache Struts 2, again, 2017. Hopefully, people are not using Apache Struts 2, at least not this version. What happens is that Apache Struts 2 version does a lot of the routing for you and channeling to which page needs to be loaded, etc., and you build your stuff on top of it. However, there was a problem in this library. That problem was found and fixed in March 2017. But it was still in their system in May, and they got breached in that month. It took over 75 days, 76 days to be exact, and since they found out that people were actually snooping around, do all sorts of things, and got data out from at least 140 million customers in the United States. Up to date now, the damage is about 2.0 billion US dollars, not calculating in any brand damage it had done. But let's get into the actual hack. Hopefully this one works. I have an application here, and it runs. And it runs actually on the internet. It runs on Heroku. And it's not about Heroku, but it runs on the internet, so it's real. I don't need to go into that application, because that application has the same Apache Struts library. So as a real hacker, you normally take your black hoodie, put your hood on, and then next thing you do is you go into a terminal, because that's how it works in the movies. What I can do, I can create a curl request using a specific header, and this is the header I'm going to use. Like, it's a content type, as you can see. This is the key, and this is the content type. Who of you recognizes this content type? Come on. Ask ChatGPT. It's an invalid content type. And you might be like, oh, duh. It's an invalid content type, and in this version of Apache Struts, you go into an exceptional flow. For some reason, you are allowed to utilize OGNL in that exceptional flow, the Object Graph Navigational Language, which is an expression language. Guess what? Spring also has an expression language. But just for the sake of time, I'm not bashing Spring this time, I'm bashing Struts, because it's old. With that expression language, I can call certain methods on objects that are in memory. Or, even worse, I can create new objects. So let's see what we're done here. Let's create a new process builder. Say to that process builder, fix me a bash, and give that bash an arbitrary command. What do you think happens? At this point, I am able to do arbitrary code executions on a remote machine that is now on Heroku. Fun, right? And then I'm outputting, or then I'm connecting the output stream to an input stream to actually show the results. So let's see if this works. Let's do this one. I will explain in a second. So what I'm doing here, I'm using that header I showed you, and I make a substitution. The word command goes out, and the word env goes in. And env is nothing more than a terminal command to show you the environment variables of a particular machine. Right? We're still with me? And then I do a curl minus v xget localhost. Well, it's not on localhost. Come on, it's on Heroku. Where is my Heroku app? Let's bring it here. Heroku. As a real developer advocate, you copy and paste because coding is not your thing. Let's put it on Heroku, and let's see what it does. So it tries to connect, and now as an output, I have the environment variables of my Heroku machine. So it means the env command executes. Oops. And then you might think, like, environment variables, who cares? Well, hopefully nobody put their GitHub key in their environment variables. But if I can call an environment variable, I'm also able to create a file, put some content in that file, come back tomorrow, execute that content. Good luck in your postmortem finding out what the heck happened. Even worse, in a terminal, I am able to make a reverse shell connection depending on what my privilege of the user are. So that means I can execute something there that creates a connection to my machine, and I'm just waiting on the certain port. And if it connects, I'm in, I have a shell connection, and I can do all the stuff that I want. So this is bad. And this was just because someone was using an outdated version of Apache Struts 2. Having updated this and having scanned this in the proper way, now let's check if I can show you this. And again, I'm using my own tooling. Need to log in with GitHub. Yeah, it's fine. Hopefully the internet works with me. But if I scanned this, I would have known that this is an outdated version, and there's a newer version available, and that version would already fix these problems for me by just updating to a newer, minor version of this simple application. Obviously, there are a ton of vulnerabilities in there because I created it. This is in my POM file. And what we can see here, it has Apache Struts 2 core. And it has version 2.3.20 in, but if I would update it to 2.3.32, this thing would not have happened. If Equifax would have done that in March of that year and not after May plus 75 days, it would not have happened. But guess what? Most companies are not looking at what is already in production. They're looking at what is my new task on my Jira board. And let's make sure that that is not vulnerable. But what's not vulnerable today might be vulnerable tomorrow. Because things get found over time. So, getting back to my slide deck, if this is your application, this is the code you wrote. And we all agree that we do pair programming or code review, so we take care of our code in a very good way. But how much do we take care of that yellow part? Do you ever look at your dependencies and update them? Do you ever look at that and get rid of a certain dependency? Because everything that is available in your class path can technically be loaded in memory. That's how Java works. Fun story. I worked at a bank once, one of the major banks in the Netherlands. I won't call them out the name, but just look at my LinkedIn profile and you will find out. I come there, I looked at their Maven POM file, and they had 4 different XML marshalers in it. God knows why, because the JDK already sent you a certain amount of XML marshalers. But what happens is somebody builds something with library 1, the next person comes in, I don't know library 1, let's use library 2, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. What goes in never goes out in many, many companies. And they can all be part of a phase in an attack chain. Because in most cases, I just connect a few dots together and I can get in. So we need to take care of that. Fun story. We created a small application in the horrible language called JavaScript. 19 lines of code, which seems great for a file store in S3 bucket. It had 2 dependencies, and well, it's Node. So how many dependencies do I actually pull into my application? Make a guess. Million? Nah, it's not that bad. It's just 19. But now the thing, like as a developer, I'm responsible for my code, and I think my code, 19 lines, I can do that on my own. But in fact, I'm also responsible for all the dependencies. How many lines of code is my team responsible for? Make a guess. Again, it's not millions. It's also not 19. 4,000, almost. 191,155 lines of code. And then you might say, like, okay, in Node, things are siloed and things are sandboxed. Okay, let's go to Java. In this case, a Spring Serverless application with 222 lines of awful code, because we wrote this as a demo. Don't look at the code. It doesn't have any good practices in it, but it was code. Had 5 dependencies, and the 5 dependencies, in this case a Maven application, came back to 54 dependencies in a one big hell of a jar. Now you can guess, how many lines of code is my team, my Java team, responsible for? Just shy of 500,000 lines of code. That means we should take care of 500,000 lines of code and not about 222. We should take care as much pride in checking our dependencies as in checking our own code. And that is easy, but we have to know that open source usage has exploded. And it can be actual open source or not really open, doesn't matter. if it is available to somebody else, people will look at it and reverse engineer it. Because attackers are targeting that to see, like, if something is vulnerable and it is disclosed and it's out in the open, you probably know if you scan it correctly or know of it or something like that, but somebody else as well. So saying like, I deprioritize that, I'm just going for that new feature, might not always be the best choice. Small research we did until 2019 to see like how many packages are there in every ecosystem new on board, and obviously node is the clear winner. We can say something about quality, but I'm not going to do that. Unfortunately, we see that a lot of packages, how many vulnerabilities were found per ecosystem. We saw in 2019, at least, that Maven Central was the clear winner, because a lot of packages there are composed packages using a lot of other things. NPM has a lot of smaller packages that you can use. We are using larger frameworks in general. That is the gist of it. But talking about packages and talking about history, where were you on December 10th, 2021? I heard people like, you know what I'm talking about. I was trying to go on vacation. Really. I booked a flight to Bonaire, which is a nice Caribbean island next to Aruba. Guess what? That didn't happen. Something log4shell. Again, a library. Many people used it. In our customer base, we saw that 60% of our customers used this as a transitive dependency, a dependency under the hood. People didn't even know that they were using it. 17,000 packages at that day were instantly vulnerable because all versions were vulnerable at that date. Fun fact, the pull request that created the problem was there since 2013. Thing was, in the first 72 hours that this was actually publicly disclosed, we have seen over 800,000 mostly automated attacks. We don't know how successful they were because nobody tells us. The thing is, what we can do with log4shell is quite easy, and it took me, once I understood the problem, it took me like 35 to 40 minutes to create an exploit for it. Thing is, if you have an application, like this is my application, and I know that something is logged, for instance, I'm logging in with a username and a password. Password is wrong. You probably have a log line, user Brian failed attempt 1, something like that. So I know that the username will get logged. Let's use that as an example. If I can do that, I can create a string like this, and this string will be evaluated. It does a JNDI lookup, which means it doesn't only look at something, it picks it up. It brings it back. So it brings back a remote object, for instance. For some reason, somebody thought it was great to connect this to an LDAP protocol, because why not? So that means if I own the LDAP server at evil.com, I can give you a reference to a file that I own. So let's do that. The JNDI lookup goes to my LDAP. I respond with a pointer to wherever that file is located. That file is located also on evil.com, goes back, comes in your system, and gets executed. Oops. Because what if a file looks like this? A file needs to look like this. It needs to implement the object factory. If you implement the object factory, you have to override the getObject instance. And the getObject instance will get called once it is in your system. That means I can now open the calculator, which is cool if you want to calculate things, but not really special. But it shows again that I can execute code on your machine. Let me show you. Over here, I have my application that runs on an old version of Java. This is my thing. Let me enlarge this so you can actually see if I log in with my username Brian and I just smash my keyboard twice. You see that the name at least will get failed login attempt username Brian. So I can use the username to do that exploit. Let's first manage my things that 1Password is not screaming at me that I'm doing things wrong, because it is right. You cannot do this normally. So here I have my LDAP server and my HTTP server running on port 9,999, and my HTTP server, which serves that exact same code that I showed you on the slide with opening the calculator on port 8,000, all on my local host. Because if I go to the outside, my security engineers will call me again, Brian, what the heck are you doing? We're closing down your laptop. That happened already before. I have such a good relationship with my security team. It's great. So I can do something like this. Connect to the LDAP on my local host, port 999/evil. That gives me that thing. Smash on my keyboard because it needs to be wrong. And I'm good at that. So if I sign in on that, you see that my calculator pops up. This also means I can use this vehicle to do all sorts of things. I can use it to execute gadget chains in your class path. I can use it to do reverse shell attacks. I can now execute code on your machine by just simply log in with a silly string. This was the problem with Log4Shell, and it was super easy to recreate. Yes, updating to newer versions of Java could help you a bit, but then still, if there were gadget chains, as in deserializationable gadget chains available in your class path, it could basically use this as a vehicle to enter that. Not going into that, that is a whole different talk that takes at least an hour, and I don't want to bore you to death. So you see that having Log4Shell as a dependency, shitty. So you should have scanned. So you should know, and once it was out, you should have been pinged actively and replace it with a new version. So, okay, enough about this. We ask open source maintainers, how confident are you in your own security? 63% says, kinda. Okay, we do code reviews and pair programming because else we cannot push to the master branch, but we blindly trust, kinda. Sounds like my little son. Yeah, it's fine. We asked them, how do you find out about vulnerabilities? 27% of the people said, of the maintainers said, I probably won't, because I'm just a developer. And that brings me to the question, who is responsible for security? Is it the developer? Is it the security team? Is it operations? Is it somebody else? Is it nobody? We asked that to the general public, and this was the result. It is a shared responsibility between developer, security, and operations. So that DevSecOps makes kind of sense. Thing is, if you think about software as in the binary, in this case the jar file for my Spring Boot application, developers need to take their fair share. 85% says, yeah, developers need to take their fair share. Because you probably work in an autonomous team. You can make you get a problem and your team is able to solve it, right? In the way you want, because your manager knows crap about it, has no clue what programming means. So he's like, yeah, you're working, it's fine. He just trusts you that that will happen. So you make these decisions based on your knowledge, your code, Stack Overflow, and ChatGPT. And it runs on my machine, all tests are green. But it should not only be scalable and maintainable, it should also be the secure solution for both your code and your dependencies if you bring them in. Think about it. If I build a house, I trust that the builders know what they're doing. Same as with software. So we talked about code, open source, but nowadays that's not enough. We need to deliver this in, for instance, a container, because now the environment is also important, because it might need to use different binaries or not. It's not, we don't put it on application servers anymore. No, it's the run somewhere in the cloud inside a container. What is the first line in most Docker images? From. Well, basically from and on something, right? From Ubuntu, from Debian. Early 2020, I did a research on the most commonly used base images from Docker Hub that were freely available. You did not have to pay for them. And I scanned them for vulnerabilities in the operating system layer. Notice the clear winner, which again is funny because my manager is a Node developer. So I laughed my face off. And then when we looked at it, this is the latest version. So no specific tag, no specific hash or something like that. It was just the latest at that point in time. The latest Node image was based at that point on full Debian Jessie. Do you need a full Debian enterprise operating system for my small microservice? Probably not, because it brings in a ton of crap and a ton of executables that can be part in a chain of attacks. And that's mostly the problem, because Node itself was not that vulnerable. Most of these 500-something vulnerabilities came from Debian at that point. This also means that if you have a base image, even if your application does not change, just changing out the base image might already get rid of a ton of vulnerabilities in the layer of the container. We asked people, when do you scan your Docker images for operating system vulnerabilities? And 50% said, I don't. Also, how do you find out about new vulnerabilities in deployed containers? 45% said, I won't. But is there actually a problem? Well, sure. Let me show you. So I have, you've seen that application here on Heroku, but I have the same application running on my local host inside a container. So let's go to that container. That container is over here. It runs, and let me show you the Docker file, and I will enlarge. I will zoom in a second. So this is the Docker file I'm using to build this image. Oh, from here. It starts with from. So I'm using a multi-stage build. In the first stage, I'm building my application with Maven and OpenJDK 8, because an old application, a typical lift and shift. And then I'm using the jar file that it created and put it into a Tomcat server, because, again, an old Apache Struts application. What is wrong with this Docker file? You're not paying attention. What user does it run on? Root. I do not specify a specific user. So by default, it runs on root. Second problem, Tomcat 8.5.21 is way old. And there's the problem. It doesn't matter what application I put in. 8.5.21 has an issue. And 8.5.21 has exactly this issue, an arbitrary code execution. I'm a sucker for that. Basically, I'm going to the vulnerability database, and it says, like, it was possible to upload a JSP file by a specially crafted request. This JSP file, which contained Java code, can be requested, and any code it contains will be executed server-side. That's cool. Let's go to my favorite database, the exploit database. Because, again, I'm just copy-pasting. This is a Python script, already created for me. The exploit is there. The Python script creates that specially crafted request and does two payloads. The first payload is a JSP file containing a system println with all A's, just to show, does it work? Okay, if that works, then it can do a second attack, an actual attack, with a payload that is a form. That form contains a text box and a submit button. And every time I click on that submit button, it takes the text and calls the runtime.cantor.time.execute, and then does a buffered reader on the output, basically showing you whatever happens. So I'm creating myself a web shell on your machine because you are using an outdated version of Tomcat. To show you that this file does not yet exist, don't push too hard because, yes, okay. This file does also not exist, and I loaded the stuff already over here. This is basically the Python script. So let's say check and see if it works. And it says, hey, it's vulnerable to CVE 2017-12617. That doesn't tell me anything, but maybe if I now call poc.jsp, I see all A's in my system, so I can execute JSP files, not touching your application. So let's do the second part. Call pwn, and now it says to me, uploading a web shell. Sure. Okay. Cool. Who am I? I'm root. And now I can do all sorts of crap. I can do something with packages or whatever I want, because I now created myself within a website, within a web shell website, I created myself a terminal. And I didn't put any specific user in, so I have root privileges, can now install my Bitcoin miner and just go for it. And you don't even notice, except for your AWS bill, maybe. So, you do not have to touch your application, but your image on your Docker container is just as important. It's also a dependency. So we need to take care of that. If I would have scanned this, and I did scan this on my local machine already with, in this case, our CLI, it already could have told me that I have a shitload of vulnerabilities, including, it says to me here, hey, you're using Tomcat 8521 that has 735 vulnerabilities, and 70 of them are critical. If you would update to this minor version, 8592, you only end up with 37 vulnerabilities. 0 of them are critical, and this problem would not exist just by switching out that base image. So it makes sense to look at these things over time and scan. So continuing with this, the last layer in our system would be our infrastructure as code, basically Kubernetes. Who uses Kubernetes? Poor you. I'm not going into this, but the most problems in Kubernetes are misconfiguration. A pod that has too many privileges, a pod that is available from the outside while it shouldn't be. Like these things combine them with vulnerable base images, with vulnerable problems in dependencies, and with vulnerable code, you have the whole 9 yards and a great Christmas like I had in 2021. But what is the solution? Let's go up to there because we're almost out of time. The solution is 3 things. I showed you tooling, but it's not about tooling. And then you're like, but you work for a tooling company. Yep, it's not about tooling. It's about 3 things: culture, process, and the third one is tooling. But the other ones are more important. Let's talk about culture first. You probably also have that product manager or manager that's breathing down your neck as this feature needs to go out today. And you're like, that's not possible. Okay, tomorrow morning. And you say, yes, I can. You're taking shortcuts, it works, it's fine, all tests are green, but you're actually creating technical debt, right? You see that? And we're complaining to our managers, you need to give me more time to get rid of the technical debt because at a certain point in time, I cannot innovate anymore. Sure. But what about if I am just creating things and it works, but not looking at the security things, and my security team is like, dude, really? Again? That creates friction. And in the end, it will end up with me deploying 4 times a day that bugs will get in, that security issues will get in. So we need to understand that it's our responsibility as well, next to the operations folks, next to the security folks, to think security from the get-go. If that is not there, and if your management is not agreeing, we can stop already right away. We need to agree upon that is also part of what our DNA needs to be. If that is the case, then we can look at process. Do not create new process. That only works if you are breached already, because then the focus is on you getting breached. Who was ever in the breach? I was. Back at that same bank I told you. It was another department, but yeah. The thing was, we were in the breach, and then it was actually a startup within the bank. We needed to get the features out because we did not have funding for the next fiscal year. So they were like, you need to make this work. Sure. And then we had a breach. Some silly data was leaked. That was before the GDPR laws. And then our top-level managers came to us, it's a shame your developers are not security aware. Like, what? But that's the fact. The fix was 5 minutes. The aftermath was multiple months. We need to satisfy all sorts of all sorts of Excel sheets and check boxes before we could deploy. Well, that does not work. That works for a couple of weeks. And then we go back to normal business because we need to make money. The thing is, if we create new process, that's only temporarily. But if we look at our process and see where can we improve our current process and the way we work, because we're used to this for already a few years, or maybe multiple decades, and pick the tooling that fits that process, then it might have a chance. So don't just pick tooling, because most tooling will dictate you a way how to do that. I just put it in the pipeline, and if all tests are green, it's fine. Yeah, then you didn't match my team. My team was the first team is like, okay, how can I go around my QA checks and my security checks? Because at 3 in the morning, I do not want to get bothered by these checks because they take hours. So engineers go around that. or just satisfying a tool, which is the misinterpretation of the problem. No, we need to pick the tooling in such a way that it helps me instead of work against me. And obviously, we have tooling. This is the commercial bit. I will go very fast. We have Sneak Code for code testing. We have plugins. We have Sneak Open Source for open source testing. We have container testing. We have infrastructure as code testing. Done. The thing is, the testing is not so much the problem. You can use tests for my competitors. It's fine. The thing is, you need to test it not only in your pipeline, because that's what people think. Yeah, we need to have it in a pipeline. Sure, you need to have it there. Absolutely. But why not do it on your local machine? I just did it for my container with my CLI. I can do that before I commit to my master branch. I can do it in my IDE. While I'm coding, every now and then click a button, scan it for me, and it comes back with results. And I can actively remediate that before it hits the repository. My code lives in the repository for multiple days, maybe weeks. Let's make sure that it is there and it gets automatically, for instance, updated with new releases. Obviously, we can do that, but there's also other tooling like Dependabot or something like that that can help you upgrade your dependencies. Spoiler, we do a better job. Anyway, connect it there because your code lives there and scan it over time. Yes, you have a CI pipeline, and yes, you need to scan it there as well before you go to production. Sure. We can have a debate if you need to block or not. My security team says we block it. I say don't do that because there are multiple reasons why not to block it. For instance, the 3 o'clock in the morning thing. Had that before. We will go around it because in the end the customer is even more important, depending on the severity of the problem. But when you are in production, just don't look at your next Jira ticket. No, we need to monitor that. That happened to Equifax. That still happens to a lot of folks that have the vulnerable version of Log4Shell, which is still downloaded thousands of times every single week. You're like, crazy? No, it's not. Every single week, probably a few thousands are on my demos, sure, but still there are a few thousand of people that every week that download the old version of Log4Shell and use it for whatever reason. So if something is in production, at that point, your dependency tree is static. Why not monitor that? I can easily do that with my tooling, but it monitors the dependency tree and scans it on a daily basis. And if a new problem is found, I get actively pinged, or a pull request gets created. Same happens for my Docker container. So take care of whatever is in production and keep an eye on that actively, or make sure that your tooling does that actively so you don't have to look at that every single time and click buttons. The thing is, tooling needs to fit your process. We do not want to kill developer productivity. No, we actually need to enable it. If it works, if you don't have a CI pipeline, God knows why, but if you don't have, it doesn't make sense to create a CI pipeline just for security scanning. No, it might be way better to connect it to, I don't know, your Maven build, your Gradle build. Every time it builds, it checks. Makes it easy, right? So we'll look at the way you work and don't let the tool dictate how you do it. Because in the end, we need to make sure that we're still going on. And don't just do it one time. No, security or software development is a continuous cycle. There is no beginning, there is no end. We already agreed that most of the things that we do is maintenance. So, you know that MVPs that stayed in production for years, we all know that. And it keeps on going. So we need to do that constantly and in every slice of our SDLC. So keep doing this and make sure that this is part of your mindset. Last but not least, as Sneak, we have an office here in Cluj, and obviously we are hiring. If you are bright minds and you want to do something in security and help create tooling that is actually actionable for developers, feel free to look at sneak.io, scan the QR code, because we have multiple positions open here in our office in Cluj. So far, so good. Thanks for your attention. Hope this was useful. Are there any questions? Are you still awake? I see people smiling, so that's a yes. If you still have questions afterwards, ping me on LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever, email me, send a postal pigeon, smoke signals, whatever works for you. I'd be more than happy to help you out. All right? Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Cheers.